16 months after Pearl Harbor, 16 American fighter pilots took off to kill the man who ordered it. This is the only mission in the entire Second World War where the United States targeted a single enemy officer by name. And it should have been impossible. 7:10 in the morning, April 18th, 1943. Fighter 2 airstrip, Guadalcanal. Major John Mitchell, 28 years old, sits in the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning with a naval compass strapped to his instrument panel. In front of him lies 400 miles of open Pacific Ocean. No landmarks, no radio, no margin for error. If he arrives at his intercept point even 60 seconds late, the target is gone forever. The target is the man who bombed Pearl Harbor. 2 hours and 23 minutes later, in a P-38 named Miss Virginia, flying 20 feet above the jungle canopy of Bougainville, First Lieutenant Rex Barber squeezes the trigger of 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon. A green Japanese bomber begins to burn. Mitchell had arrived exactly 1 minute early. One American pilot would not return. His name was Raymond Hine, and this is the mission that erased him from history. Operation Vengeance. To understand how 16 American fighter pilots came to be hunting the most powerful naval officer in the Pacific, we have to go back 492 days, back to a Sunday morning in Hawaii, back to the man who planned it. Isoroku Yamamoto was 59 years old in April of 1943. He was small, quiet, and physically marked by war. 2 fingers on his left hand were gone, torn away by shrapnel at the Battle of Tsushima in 1904, when he was a 20-year-old ensign. His stomach carried scars from the same battle. He drank little, gambled well, and had spent nearly 6 years of his life living in the United States. He had studied at Harvard. He had traveled America by train from New York to Texas to the oil fields of Mexico. He had watched Detroit build cars. He had watched Pittsburgh pour steel. And that is why, when the Imperial Japanese Navy pushed for war with America in 1941, Yamamoto was the loudest voice in the room, begging them not to do it. He told the Prime Minister that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months, maybe 12. After that, he made no promises. He warned that a war with America would end in defeat. He wrote it in letters. He said it in meetings. He said it to his own aides. They ignored him. And so the man who did not believe in the war became the man who planned its opening blow. On the 7th of December, 1941, 353 aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor. The architect of that strike was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He had built the operation with the precision of a chess player planning 10 moves ahead. He had won, and he had known, even as he won, that he had lost. That contradiction lived inside him for the next 16 months. By April of 1943, the war he predicted had arrived. Midway had cost Japan 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers. Guadalcanal had cost them thousands of men, and worse, hundreds of trained naval aviators they could not replace. American factories were producing aircraft faster than Japan could shoot them down. American shipyards were launching destroyers on schedules. Japanese planners refused to believe. Yamamoto knew what the numbers meant. He launched one last offensive anyway. He called it Operation I Go. It was a sustained aerial campaign to smash Allied air bases and shipping across the Solomons and New Guinea. It began on the 1st of April, 1943. Waves of Japanese aircraft struck targets across the region. Pilots returned to their bases with wild claims of American ships sunk and airfields destroyed. Yamamoto, headquartered in Rabaul, accepted the reports at face value. On the 16th of April, he ended the operation, satisfied. The reports were exaggerations. Operation Igo had cost Japan more aircraft than it had destroyed, and Yamamoto never knew it. Because on the 13th of April, 3 days before he ended the campaign, he made the decision that would kill him. He decided to visit the front lines in person. He would fly from Rabaul on the northern tip of New Britain down through the Solomons to inspect the forward bases. He would visit airfields at Balalay near the southern tip of Bougainville. He would greet his pilots. He would raise morale. He was a small man in a white uniform, and he understood the power of being seen by exhausted young men in the jungle. His staff sent the itinerary out by radio. It went to 5 commands. It was encoded in JN-25, the operational cipher of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It listed his departure time, his arrival time, his aircraft type, his escort strength, and his exact route. It was, by the standards of any modern intelligence officer, a suicide note. The Japanese Navy believed JN-25 was unbreakable. They were wrong. 6,000 miles away, in a basement office in Pearl Harbor, a team of American cryptanalysts had been quietly reading JN-25 for over a year. The office was called Station Hypo. Its head cryptanalyst was Commander Joseph Rochefort. Its fleet intelligence officer was Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton. It was Layton who had helped predict the Japanese assault on Midway 10 months earlier, and Layton who had earned the personal trust of Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the entire Pacific Fleet. On the morning of the 14th of April, 2 of Layton's men walked into his office, holding a decoded intercept. Layton read it. Then he walked down the corridor to Nimitz. The Admiral looked up. He asked one question: "Do we try to get him?" The answer was not simple. Killing Yamamoto meant the loss of Japan's most experienced naval commander, but it also meant risking JN-25 itself. If the Japanese realized their code was broken, they would change it, and the greatest intelligence advantage the United States held in the Pacific would vanish overnight. Nimitz did not decide alone. The question went to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox in Washington. Knox brought it to President Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt gave the order, "Get Yamamoto." Now the problem was mechanical. Yamamoto would be flying between Rabaul and Balalay. His route ran over Japanese-held territory the entire way. The nearest American airbase capable of launching an interception was Fighter II, a rough coral airstrip on Guadalcanal, more than 400 miles from the intercept point. 400 miles out, 400 miles back. Plus combat time. Plus the reserve fuel required to survive a running dogfight and still make it home. No fighter in the United States Navy could do it. The F-4F Wildcat did not have the range. The new F-4U Corsair did not have the range in the numbers required. The Army Air Force's P-40 Warhawk did not have the range. Every single frontline fighter in the American arsenal fell short. Every single one except for one. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The Lightning had been designed 6 years earlier, in 1937, by 2 men working out of a converted bourbon distillery in Burbank, California. The chief engineer was Hall Hibbard. His assistant, a 27-year-old aeronautical prodigy from a mining town in Michigan, was Clarence Johnson. Everyone called him Kelly. What Hibbard and Johnson drew looked like nothing else in the sky. Twin booms, twin tails, two Allison V-1710 engines mounted in nacelles that stretched back into those long tail booms. A central pod between them, no larger than a coffin, holding the pilot and the guns. 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns and one 20mm Hispano cannon, all mounted in the nose. Because the guns did not have to shoot through a spinning propeller, they did not have to be aimed outward to converge at a distant point. They fired straight ahead in a single, tight column of destruction. At 500 yards, a P-38 could put every round it carried into a target the size of a bathtub. It could climb faster than most fighters of its era. It could dive faster than any of them. And with 2 engines, it could take a beating and still bring its pilot home. Most of all, it could fly, and fly, and fly. With 2 external drop tanks, one 310-gallon under the left wing and one 165-gallon under the right, a P-38G model could reach out more than 1,000 miles and still fight when it got there. No other American fighter in the Pacific in April of 1943 could match that number. The Japanese had a name for it, whispered by the pilots who faced it over New Guinea and the Solomons. They called it the Fork-tailed Devil. On the morning of the 17th of April, on the coral strip at Fighter 2, Guadalcanal, 18 P-38s sat waiting. Ground crews worked through the day and into the night, fitting the special drop tanks, checking every fuel line, every spark plug, every round of ammunition. The pilots did not yet know the target. They had been told only that they would intercept a high-ranking Japanese officer whose flight had been reported by an Australian coast watcher. That was a lie. There was no coast watcher. The lie existed to protect JN-25. The pilots would not learn the truth for another 2 years. The man chosen to lead them was 28 years old. His name was Major John William Mitchell. He commanded the 339th Fighter Squadron. He had grown up in Mississippi, joined the Army before the war, and had spent the last year over the Solomons learning to shoot down Japanese aircraft. He was quiet, methodical, and unshakably calm. He was, by the assessment of every pilot who flew with him, the finest natural navigator in the theater. Mitchell would need to be. Because what Nimitz was asking him to do had never been attempted. Fly 400 miles over open ocean, at 50 feet above the waves, in complete radio silence, on nothing but a compass and a wristwatch. Arrive at a point in the sky he had never seen, at a time calculated to the minute, and be there when a specific aircraft, flown by a specific pilot, carrying a specific man, passed overhead. If he was 5 minutes early, the target would not be there. If he was 5 minutes late, the target would already be on the ground. The margin for error was 0. The plan called for 4 pilots to form the killer flight. Their job was to attack the 2 Betty bombers and shoot down Yamamoto. 12 more pilots, led by Mitchell himself, would climb to 18,000 feet as top cover, ready to engage the 75 to 100 Japanese Zeros based at nearby Kahili airfield. The 4 killer pilots were named that night. Captain Thomas George Lanphier Jr., 27 years old, would lead the killer flight. He was the son of an Army Air Corps colonel. He was ambitious, articulate, and hungry for recognition. Flying his wing would be First Lieutenant Rex Barber, 25 years old. An Oregon farm boy, quiet enough that some pilots thought him shy. He was not shy, he was patient. And when he decided to shoot, he did not miss. His usual aircraft, a P-38 named Diablo, was on the ground with a damaged wing. For this mission, he would fly a borrowed Lightning. Its name, painted on the fuselage, in bright letters, was Miss Virginia. The second element of the killer flight was Lieutenant James McClanahan and Lieutenant Joe Moore. Both were experienced. Both were reliable. Neither of them would fire a shot on the 18th of April. That night, in tents scattered across the mud of Guadalcanal, 16 young men tried to sleep. Most of them did not know they were about to fly the longest interception mission of the Second World War. Most of them did not know they were hunting the man who had bombed Pearl Harbor. And none of them knew that one among their number would not come home. His name was Raymond Hine. He was 23 years old. And in less than 18 hours, his P-38 Lightning would vanish into the Pacific and be lost to history forever. The morning of the 18th of April, 1943, came to Guadalcanal wet and gray. It was Palm Sunday, 6,000 miles away, in churches across America. Families were putting on their best clothes. On Guadalcanal, 16 pilots ate breakfast in silence. They walked to their aircraft in the pre-dawn dark. Fighter 2 was not really an airstrip. It was a scar of pierced steel planking, laid across a patch of coral and mud, hacked out of the jungle 6 months earlier. Palm stumps still stood at the edges. When it rained, the surface bled water. When it dried, red dust choked the engines. The P-38 Lightnings were parked in dispersal revetments, cut it into the jungle, their long noses pointing north, toward the Pacific and toward Bougainville. Major John Mitchell walked the flight line one final time. He checked each aircraft himself. He spoke briefly with each pilot. He was 28 years old, and he was about to lead a mission that had no precedent in the history of aerial warfare. The intercept point was more than 400 miles away, over the Coral Sea, 10 miles west of Empress Augusta Bay on the Bougainville coast. Mitchell had planned the route in 4 legs. The first leg would take the formation west-southwest, out over the ocean, well away from any Japanese observation post. The second leg would turn them north. The third would turn them further, curling them around the southern approach to Bougainville. The fourth would bring them in from the west, ambushing Yamamoto from the direction the Japanese would least expect. The total distance to the intercept point, flying that route, was over 400 miles. The total distance for the mission, out and back, was over 1,000 miles. Every leg had been calculated on paper the night before, using nothing more than dead reckoning. Wind speed at wave top height, air speed, time, heading. If any of the 4 variables was off, the formation would miss the intercept, and the mission would end in failure over an empty patch of sky. Mitchell had strapped a naval compass to his instrument panel. He had a wristwatch. He had a slide rule. That was the entire navigation system for an interception carrying the direct approval of the President of the United States. At 7:10 in the morning, the first P-38 rolled onto the strip. 2 Allison engines roared up to take off power. The twin booms trembled. The Lightning surged forward, tail lifting, wheels finally leaving the pierced steel planking. It banked west and vanished into the gray. The others followed at intervals. Then, before the last aircraft had cleared the strip, the mission almost died. The second aircraft of the killer flight was piloted by Lieutenant James McClanahan. He was rolling at full takeoff speed when a tire blew. The Lightning slewed sideways. McClanahan fought it, cut the throttles and dragged the aircraft to a stop on the edge of the strip. He climbed out and watched the rest of the formation lift off without him. 200 miles later, over the open Pacific, the second problem hit. Lieutenant Joe Moore, the fourth member of the killer flight, could not transfer fuel from his belly tank. Without that fuel, he would never make it home. He turned back. In the space of 2 hours, half of the killer flight was gone. Mitchell had anticipated this. He had briefed 2 reserve pilots the night before, both flying in the top cover element, that they might be needed to fill in. Now, over the open ocean in radio silence, he signaled them forward with hand gestures from the cockpit. The first replacement was Lieutenant Besby Holmes. He was 25 years old, competent, steady. He slid into position without hesitation. The second replacement was Lieutenant Raymond K. Hine. He had joined the squadron only weeks earlier. He had never flown as a killer flight pilot in his life. He had never trained for this specific role. He moved into position on Holmes's wing, and he did what he was told, and he flew on. Mitchell now had 2 choices. He could abort the mission. 16 aircraft down to 2 experienced killers and 2 hastily promoted reserves was not the strike force that had briefed the night before. Any commander would have been justified in turning around. Or he could continue with the men he had and gamble that 4 lightnings would be enough to kill an admiral. He chose to continue. One of the 2 young men he had just moved into the killer flight would not come home. For the next hour and 40 minutes, 16 P-38s flew west and then north across the Coral Sea at 50 feet above the water. The canopies were sealed shut. The Lightning had been designed for high-altitude combat over Europe, not tropical wave hopping in the South Pacific, and its cockpit was not built to open in flight. The tropical sun, filtering through the plexiglass, turned every cockpit into a greenhouse. Pilots stripped to their shirts. Sweat pooled in their boots. Some of them later would remember watching their own vision blur from the heat. Below them, the Pacific slid past. There were no islands, no landmarks, no radio chatter, nothing but the deep blue of open water, close enough that the propeller wash left a wake on the surface. Mitchell led. He held his heading with the compass on his instrument panel and the second hand on his wristwatch. Every few minutes he adjusted for wind drift, guessing it from the whitecaps below. He had been doing this in his head since Mississippi. He had never done it with a mission of this weight riding on his shoulders. The first turn came exactly when he said it would. The second turn came exactly when he said it would. The third turn came exactly when he said it would. At 9:33 in the morning, 2 hours and 23 minutes after takeoff, Major John Mitchell looked to his right and saw, rising out of the sea haze, the green mountains of Bougainville. He was 1 minute early, more than 400 miles of ocean, flown without a single navigational aid beyond a compass and a watch, and Mitchell had arrived at the intercept point 60 seconds ahead of schedule. He climbed. The formation climbed with him. And then, at 9:34 in the morning, one of the pilots broke radio silence with 2 words. Bogies. 11 o'clock high. Every head in the formation turned. There, high above the jungle canopy, painted dark green with red circles on the wings, were 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers. The Americans called them Bettys, long, cigar-shaped, twin-engined. Behind them and above them, 6 Zero fighters flew escort in 2-3 ship formations. There was supposed to be 1 bomber. There were 2. For a moment, Nobody in the American formation knew which Betty carried Admiral Yamamoto. The two bombers were beginning their descent into Balalay. They were flying line abreast, wingtip to wingtip. The lead Betty carried the Admiral, his personal staff surgeon, and several officers. The second Betty carried Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, along with more staff officers. Both bombers were unarmed. Their machine gun positions were empty. In the doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy in April of 1943, this deep behind their own lines, over an airspace, controlled by 3 separate fighter bases, they did not need to be armed. They carried 1 belt of ammunition for each defensive gun, and no gunners at the guns. Nobody had briefed them for an ambush this far from any American base. Nobody believed such a thing was possible. Mitchell keyed his radio. "He's your meat, Tom." Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber released their drop tanks and turned toward the bombers. Behind them, Holmes struggled with his own tanks. They would not release. He banked away from the killer element, still burdened by the drag, hoping the extra speed of a dive might shake them loose. Hine, following orders, stayed on Holmes's wing. 2 Lightnings would attack. 2 would trail behind, fighting drop tanks. And 12 more, led by Mitchell himself, climbed toward 18,000 feet to cover the killers from the 75 to 100 Zeros, expected to launch from Kahili airfield. Except the Zeros never came. The alert never went out. A failure of debriefing, of communication, of the routine mission tempo the Japanese had allowed themselves to fall into. The Kahili fighter squadrons never scrambled. The sky above Bougainville on this one morning of this 1 hour would belong to 16 American pilots and 6 escort Zeros already committed to their tour. The 6 escort Zeros saw the P-38s only when it was already too late. They jettisoned their own belly tanks and dove hard, trying to interpose themselves between the Lightnings and the bombers. Lanphier saw them coming. He pulled his nose up and climbed straight into the descending Zeros, hoping to hold them off. The lead Japanese pilot fired first and missed. Lanphier fired back and damaged one. The formation of Zeros scattered around him. In the next 30 seconds, Lanphier would be fighting for his life against 3 enemy fighters at 12,000 feet. Barber did not follow him up. Barber saw the 2 Bettys still flying line abreast, still descending, still unaware. He rolled Miss Virginia hard right, and Dove. The lead Betty was directly in front of him. Behind Barber, 2 of the escort Zeros peeled off from the fight with Lanphier and dove to intercept him. He never looked back. He knew if he broke off to engage them, the Betty would escape into the trees. He closed the gap at nearly 400 miles per hour. The Betty grew in his gun sight. He could see the pilot in the cockpit. He could see the red circle on the wing. At 200 yards, he squeezed the trigger. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 120mm cannon opened fire from the nose of Miss Virginia. All 5 weapons fired simultaneously, all 5 converging into a single tight cone of destruction directly ahead of him. The rounds walked across the Betty from tail to nose. They tore through the right engine. Smoke exploded from the cowling. They tore through the left engine. The propeller stopped mid-rotation. They tore through the fuselage. Inside that fuselage, in the 3rd seat of the passenger compartment, an old man in a white uniform took 2 50 caliber rounds to the body. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was dead before the aircraft hit the ground. The Betty stalled. The right wing dropped. It pitched forward and rolled toward the jungle canopy below. Barber pulled up so hard he nearly collided with the falling bomber. He passed within feet of it, close enough to see the paint scheme on the fuselage as it fell past him. Then it was gone, dropping into the trees. A moment later, from the corner of his eye, he saw a black column of smoke rise from the jungle behind him. Something enormous had just burned. He turned toward the coast. The second Betty, carrying Vice Admiral Ugaki, had broken away in the opposite direction. Its pilot, seeing the first bomber die, dove for the water and turned east, trying to escape at wave-top height. He almost made it. Holmes had finally shaken his drop tanks. He and Hine were back in the fight. They spotted the second Betty, low over the water, and closed on it from behind. Holmes opened fire. His rounds walked across the Betty and struck the right engine. A trail of white vapor streamed back from the wing. The bomber began to lose altitude. Barber, arriving from the other direction, saw the crippled Betty and joined the attack. He fired one burst. The Betty exploded in mid-air, likely from the ignited fuel vapor Holmes had already torn open. Wreckage cartwheeled across the surface of the water and slammed into the sea. Somewhere inside that wreckage, Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki was still alive. 3 men from that bomber would survive. Ugaki would be pulled from the water by a Japanese search party hours later, broken and bleeding, but alive. He would live to lead a fleet again. He would live to see the P-38 Lightning become one of the most feared aircraft in the Pacific. He would live all the way to the last day of the war, in August of 1945, before he made a final decision of his own. But that was more than 2 years away. For now, on the morning of the 18th of April, 1943, 3 American pilots and 1 missing wingman were disengaging from the fight of their lives. Miss Virginia was riddled with bullet holes. Barber counted them later on the ground at Guadalcanal. There were more than 100. Some of them came from Zeros he had never seen firing at him. Some came from the crashed Betty's fuel tanks exploding as he flew through the debris. The paint of the destroyed bomber was streaked across the leading edge of one wing. Holmes was hit, but flying. Lanfear was disengaging from the Zeros above, still alive, claiming to have hit a Betty on his way down. Mitchell and the top cover element, watching from 18,000 feet, had briefly engaged some of the reacting Zeros, but scored no confirmed kills. They were now sweeping the sky, looking for the killers, counting heads, calling the formation together for the long flight home. 15 P-38s turned south toward Guadalcanal. There should have been 16. Somewhere behind them, somewhere in the airspace between Bougainville and the empty ocean, Lieutenant Raymond Hine was flying alone. His Lightning was streaming smoke from one engine. A PBY Catalina patrol aircraft, flying a routine sweep hundreds of miles away, would later report seeing a single P-38, twin-engined and unmistakable, flying low over the water with smoke pouring from its port nacelle. That aircraft was never seen again. Hine did not answer radio calls. He did not appear over Guadalcanal that afternoon. He did not appear over Guadalcanal that evening. He did not appear at all. The other 15 P-38s came home, one by one, engines coughing on fumes, drop tanks long gone. Ground crews counted them onto the strip. 14. 15. Then they waited. Nothing more came. That evening, in the wooden operations shack on Guadalcanal, Major John Mitchell wrote a mission report. It was terse, factual, and careful. It did not mention Yamamoto by name. That name was still a secret, but it recorded, in one short line among the paragraphs of technical detail, the loss of one American aircraft and one American pilot. Missing in action. Presumed lost. Lieutenant Raymond K. Hine. The mission had done what Roosevelt ordered. The architect of Pearl Harbor was dead in the jungle of Bougainville. The strategy of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific had, in 80 seconds, been decapitated. But the cost had a name, and the P-38 Lightning that carried it was somewhere at the bottom of the Pacific. Its pilot with it, both of them beginning a silence that would last more than 80 years. The news did not travel fast. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters received the first report on the afternoon of the 18th of April. They did not release it. They did not tell the Navy. They did not tell the Army. They did not tell the Prime Minister. For 33 days, the death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto remained the most closely guarded secret in the Empire of Japan. A search party reached the crash site in the jungle south of Bougainville on the morning of the 19th. They cut through the vines and the wreckage, and they found the Admiral where the Betty had thrown him. He was still strapped in his seat. The seat had been thrown clear of the fuselage on impact. He sat upright beneath a tree, his gloved hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, his head tilted forward as though he had fallen asleep. 2 .50 caliber rounds had passed through his body. One entered his lower jaw and exited above his right eye. The other struck him in the left shoulder. The autopsy determined he was dead before the aircraft touched the trees. They cremated him in the jungle. They flew his ashes to truck, then loaded them aboard the battleship Musashi, his last flagship. The Musashi carried him home to Yokosuka. On the 21st of May, Radio Tokyo finally announced that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had died leading his forces from the front lines. The nation stopped. Newspapers printed black borders. Radio stations played funeral music. In Tokyo, on the 5th of June, more than 1 million people lined the streets for a state funeral, the first granted to a commoner since the death of Admiral Togo in 1934. Part of his ashes were interred beside Togo's, the 2 admirals who had defined Japanese naval power in the 20th century, now sharing the same soil. Behind the ceremony, the Imperial Navy was already trying to answer the same question Yamamoto had asked in his final seconds. How did they know? The Japanese launched an investigation. They considered a compromised code. They considered a spy in Rabaul. They considered a coincidence. They settled on the coincidence. The Americans, through the cover story of an Australian coastwatcher, had convinced them of a lie so useful that JN-25 remained readable for the rest of the war. Every major naval message the Imperial Navy sent for the next 27 months was read in Pearl Harbor before it was read in Tokyo. Yamamoto's replacement was Admiral Minachi Koga, 57 years old, competent, respected, utterly unable to fill the void. Koga himself said it best in a private conversation recorded by his staff. There was only one Yamamoto, and no one can replace him. Koga would die less than a year later, in another aircraft accident, in another tropical storm, off the Philippines. The Imperial Japanese Navy, from the 18th of April onward, was leaderless in the way that matters most. It had commanders. It did not have a Yamamoto, and the P-38 Lightning kept flying. From April of 1943 until the end of the war, the fork-tailed devil ranged the length and breadth of the Pacific. It shot down more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter of the war. It flew from Guadalcanal to New Guinea, to the Philippines, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa. Its pilots became aces at a rate no other airframe could match. The top two American aces of the entire war, Major Richard Bong and Major Thomas Maguire, both flew P-38s. Both fought over the same waters through which 16 Lightnings had once flown to kill an admiral. The aircraft that Hall Hibbard and Kelly Johnson had drawn inside a converted bourbon distillery in 1937 had become the sword of the Pacific. But the 18th of April remained its most surgical strike. One admiral, 80 seconds. A war changed. For the men who flew that mission, the war moved on. They flew again. Some of them died. Others rotated home. And when they came home to a controversy that would last for the rest of their lives. Captain Thomas Lanphier claimed the kill. Lieutenant Rex Barber claimed the kill. Both claims were partially supported by the mission debriefs. Both claims were partially contradicted by the physical evidence. For nearly 50 years, the two men who had flown side by side into the most important intercept of the Pacific War fought each other in interviews, in books, in official reviews of the record. Lanphier wrote a memoir. Barber gave testimony. Historical panels convened. The United States Air Force, in the end, declared the kill a shared credit and refused to change the record, but the record has changed since. Modern forensic analysis of the wreckage of Yamamoto's Betty, still lying in the jungle south of Bougainville more than 80 years later, shows the pattern of bullet impacts consistent with a single attacker firing from directly behind the bomber. That is, the attack Barber flew in Miss Virginia. Lanphier was climbing to engage Zeros when the fatal rounds were fired. In 2024, a full analysis published in Air and Space Forces magazine concluded what most historians had already accepted. The man who shot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was First Lieutenant Rex Theodore Barber of Culver, Oregon. He died in 2001. He never stopped defending the claim. Lanphier died in 1987. He never stopped defending his. And the man who made them both possible, the man who navigated more than 400 miles of empty ocean by a compass and a wristwatch, and arrived exactly 1 minute early, went on to fight another war. Colonel John William Mitchell flew F-86 Sabres over Korea, shot down 4 more enemy aircraft, and retired from the United States Air Force in 1958 as a triple ace with 15 confirmed victories across 2 wars. He died in 1995 in California. He never once claimed credit for the shootdown. He said, always, that the mission belonged to every pilot who flew it, including the one who did not come home. The man who did not come home was Raymond K. Hine. His body was never found. His aircraft was never recovered. The Pacific took him, and the war moved past him, and the story of Operation Vengeance in the years that followed became the story of 2 pilots arguing over 1 bomber. In the retelling, Hine faded. His name appeared in the small print. He became, in most versions of the story, a footnote. After the war, John Mitchell tried to find out what had happened to him. In 1988, at a reunion of surviving veterans, Mitchell met a Japanese man named Kenji Yanagiya. Yanagiya had been one of the 60 pilots escorting Yamamoto's flight on the 18th of April 1943. He was the only one of the 6 to survive the war. 2 months after the Yamamoto mission, On another combat sortie over the Russell Islands, a burst of gunfire had shattered his right hand. It was amputated. He was sent home to Japan. The other 5 escort pilots were dead within a year, killed one by one over the burning waters of the Solomon Islands, hunted by the same P-38 Lightning that had killed the admiral they failed to protect. Yanagiya told Mitchell that he believed he might have shot down one of the P-38s that day. He remembered attacking a Lightning that had not dropped its fuel tanks. He remembered firing until his rounds hit home. He remembered the P-38 beginning to smoke. That aircraft could only have been Heinz. The 2 old men shook hands, one American right hand and one Japanese left, and stood together for a long time without speaking. Neither of them spoke much of the other's language. Mitchell had led the mission that killed the man who ordered Pearl Harbor. Yanagiya had, most likely, killed one of Mitchell's men. Both of them had been young once. Both of them had survived what Hein had not. Yanagiya lived until 2008. He died in Tokyo at the age of 88. But there was one man on the second Betty who did not die on the 18th of April, 1943, and whose story did not end that morning. Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, was pulled from the water of Empress Augusta Bay hours after the ambush. He was broken. His right arm was shattered. He had swallowed seawater. He had watched officers die around him inside the burning fuselage of the second Betty as it broke apart. He survived. He returned to duty within months. He rose to command the 5th Air Fleet in 1945, in charge of every kamikaze pilot sent against the American ships at Okinawa. And he spent the last 2 years of his life watching, from every base and airfield left to Japan, the P-38 Lightning that had killed his admiral roam the Pacific unchallenged. He saw it strafe his ships. He saw it shoot down his pilots. He saw it drive the Empire back across every mile of ocean it had once controlled. On the 15th of August, 1945, Emperor Hirohito broadcast Japan's surrender. Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki listened to the broadcast in his headquarters at Oita Air Base. He wrote a final entry in his diary. He removed the rank insignia from his dark green uniform. He tied a wakizashi, a short samurai sword, to his side. It was a gift given to him years earlier by Isoroku Yamamoto himself. Then he walked to the flight line. He climbed into the back seat of a Yokosuka D-Y dive bomber, an aircraft the Americans called Judy, piloted by Lieutenant Tatsuo Nakatsuru. Behind them, 10 more aircraft took off in loose formation. This was to be the final kamikaze mission of the Second World War, and Ugaki, the man who had survived the P-38 ambush of 1943, was leading it into the sunset. He sent a final radio message at 7:24 in the evening. He said he was about to ram an American ship. 15 minutes later, off the small island of Ihayajima, north of Okinawa, the crew of an American landing craft called LST-926 heard aircraft engines coming out of the dusk. Somebody shouted a warning. Anti-aircraft guns opened up. The kamikaze aircraft that reached the American ships that evening were all shot down or drove themselves into the sea. None of them struck their targets. The next morning, sailors from LST-926 went ashore on Ihayajima and found the smoldering wreckage of a cockpit on the beach. 3 bodies lay inside it. One of them, in a dark green uniform, had a short samurai sword strapped to his side. Its head had been crushed. Its right arm was gone. The Americans buried all 3 bodies in the sand where they lay. 2 years and 4 months after, the P-38 Lightning had cut down the man who ordered Pearl Harbor. It had also, in a sense, driven his second-in-command to end himself in the sky, wearing a sword given to him by the same admiral. A symmetry only the fork-tailed devil could have written. And Raymond Hine was still down there, somewhere beneath the Pacific, 23 years old, 6 weeks in the squadron. Chosen at the last minute because 2 other pilots' aircraft had broken down. Flown into a mission he had never trained for. Vanished into a piece of ocean that has never given him back. There is no marker for Raymond Hine. There is no grave. There is no wreck the divers have ever found. He is on the walls of the missing at Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines, one name among more than 36,000. Most visitors walk past it. Most Americans have never heard it, but he was there. On the morning of the 18th of April, 1943, when 16 P-38 Lightnings flew 1,000 miles to change the course of a war, Raymond Hine was one of them. And when 15 came home, and one did not, the aircraft that made the mission possible carried something home with them that has never been said out loud until now. Every P-38 Lightning that flew in the Pacific after that morning carried Raymond Hine with it. In every strafing run, in every dogfight, in every long flight home across empty water at 50 feet above the waves. The fork-tailed devil never flew alone again, and the man who ordered Pearl Harbor never flew again at all.